Okay, here is Knights of England's all-new Dash module number 2. This new module has a number of different operating modes that we can look at. This video we're going to look very briefly at the various operating modes of the unit. Now to start with, we need to look at these switches along the bottom of the unit here. In particular this one, switch number 1, identified by a small legend here. To go into normal operating mode, you're going to want to make sure that this switch is in the left-hand position, which is off. In this position, when we power the unit up, it'll go into normal operating mode. For any other operating mode, we'll put that switch into the on position. But for now, switch number 1 in the off position, power up the unit, and we go straight into normal running mode. In normal running mode, we see that we have a speed display, which we can simulate the speed on the rig here. We have a bar display and a numeric display. This is normally indicating miles per hour, but this particular module here is made for a customer in Europe who wants kilometres per hour, so that's easy to do as well. We also have, in normal running mode, a number of telltale indicators. For example, these 3 indicators here are telltales for the left turn signal, the right turn signal, and the high beam lights. We have diagnostic indicators, this one for the speedo, which if the speed signal is lost, then this comes on to indicate there's no speed signal, or you're just doing 0 miles per hour. These 2 bar gauges here are displays for the engine temperature, and the fuel gauge. If the fuel gets very low, the diagnostic indicator LED comes on, and if it goes even lower or short circuit, it'll flash to indicate a fault. Similarly for the temperature gauge, if the temperature gets very high, a warning LED will come on, and if it goes short circuit, it'll flash. Open circuit faults also cause these diagnostic LEDs to flash and store faults in memory. This is the odometer display here, showing the total miles covered, or total kilometres if it's calibrated that way. This F symbol here we'll look at in another video. This display here can be one of 4 different functions. Normally it's a trip meter display, which is resettable by button number 1. So you can reset it to 0 just by pushing that button. These 2 switches here, switch 2 and switch 3, change the function of this display. If both of these switches are off, that is to the left, it's a trip meter display. If button number 2 is switched to the right, it's a fuel gauge display, displaying the fuel in gallons or in litres, depending on the options. Push that off again. If the right-hand switch, switch number 3, is in the on position, it's a temperature gauge, displaying temperature in Fahrenheit or centigrade. If both of these switches are in the on position, then it's indicating the supply voltage to the unit, in this case 13.8 volts. So, this display here, a voltage gauge, a temperature gauge, a fuel gauge, or a trip meter display. These individual red-green indicator pairs also display a number of different functions which can be wired to various high switched inputs, green indicating on and red indicating off. So that's normal running mode of the unit. From normal running mode, we can switch straight into the display show mode by pushing and releasing button number 2. And in this mode, we can just exercise all the displays so that at car shows you can have a nice active display, which is more interesting than a static display when you're on a show. And pushing and releasing button 2 again will take us back into normal running mode. So normal running mode and show mode are both accessible with this switch number 1 in the off position. For any of the other operating modes, we need this button number 1, switch number 1, in the on position, which is to the right. So if we now power up the unit with switch number 1 to the right, we get to an operating mode select menu, where this display here is indicating the selected mode, and these displays are indicating to press button number 1 to select the desired operating mode, and button number 2 to go to this displayed operating mode. Obviously, if we push button number 2 whilst normal running mode is displayed, we'll go into the mode that we saw a moment ago, normal running mode. So power down and power up again. Every time we power up with switch number 1 in the on position, we get to this operating mode select menu. Button number 1, as we've said, selects different operating modes. The calibrate mode we can go to. We can calibrate a number of different functions which we'll look at in detail in later videos. We can calibrate the speedo, or we can use these two switches here to select different functions to calibrate. We can calibrate the fuel gauge, we can calibrate the coolant temperature sensor input, or we can calibrate the supply voltage response. Let's power down again and power up and go yet again to the operating mode select menu, and again use button number 1 to cycle through the available operating modes. Normal running mode we've looked at, calibrate mode we've looked at, show mode we've looked at, options mode is the next one we can look at, and from the options mode we can select a number of things. We can select the calibration of the speedo to be either for the USA, which is miles per hour, or Canada, which is kilometers per hour. Of course we can use this USA option for the UK as well, which uses miles, and we can use the Canadian option for Europe, which uses kilometers. Other options that we can set here include: do we want the coolant temperature sensor to be calibrated in degrees Fahrenheit or degrees Celsius? Do we want the fuel gauge to be calibrated in gallons or in litres? Do we want bar gauge number 1 to be representing coolant temperature sensor, which is the default, or fuel gauge, or supply voltage, or to randomly display a show pattern? Do we want bar gauge number 2 to display fuel, supply voltage, show mode, coolant temperature sensor? Do we want the red-green indicators to be functional or operate in show mode? And finally the option to store any changed settings. And then from there we can go straight back into normal running mode. Let's power down again and power up again with switch number 1 in this on position. So normal running mode we've looked at, calibrate mode we've looked at, show mode we've looked at, options select mode we've looked at. Diagnostic mode's an interesting one, we can select that, and from diagnostic mode we have a number of sub-modes. We can display any stored faults, which we'll look at in more detail later. Let's go out of that because it's going to take us a long time to cycle through all the stored faults. And let's go back again into diagnostic mode, and that's where we were before, looking at displayed faults, display stored faults. The other options from within the diagnostic mode are to display a journey counter, which shows how many times the unit's been powered up and powered down. Diagnostic mode, that's where we were. So display faults, journey counter, clear faults, and if we clear faults it'll clear everything from memory, and we also get the option to go back to normal running mode from there. Let's power down and back up again yet again, get into the operating mode select menu, diagnostic modes we've looked at. Display test. We push the display test button, the unit will cycle through displaying every single LED and make sure that the microcontroller can switch on and off every single LED. It'll cycle through all the elements on the odometer display, and then when it's done it'll cycle through all the elements on the speedo display, all the elements on this display, and then all the individual LEDs. I think we'll make the video too long if we watch it do everything there. So we'll switch this off and we'll power up yet again. In operating mode, select menu, and what options have we not looked at? Input test mode, there's another one here. In this mode we can display the hexadecimal value of each of the analog inputs. This one here represents the hexadecimal value of the input voltage, the fuel gauge input, so that's the fuel gauge input, and the temperature gauge input. Just gives us the ability to look at the raw inputs coming into the unit to make sure that the microcontroller is seeing them. You'll see this flickering here. This is to display that the speedo signal is actually generating pulses. So every time that flickers, that means it's receiving one pulse, so we can confirm that it's receiving input pulses from the speedo sender. And we can see that the high or low sensitivity input is being responded to, and all of these correspond to the individual inputs that the unit's wired up to. We can also use input display to make sure that these switches are being responded to. For example, switch number 1 here is wired to that LED, switch number 2 to that LED, and switch number 3 to that LED. And the push button 1 is wired to the red element of this bicolor LED, number 2 to the green element of the bicolor LED. So in this mode we can make sure that the microcontroller can see all of its inputs correctly. One more time, I think that might be everything covered. Let's just check. So normal running mode we've looked at, calibrate mode we've looked at very briefly, show mode we've looked at very briefly, options set mode, diagnostic mode, display test mode, input test mode, oh yes, and set odometer mode. If we go into this mode, it allows us to actually set the odometer value. Of course you should only do this when you're first installing the unit into your car. So in odometer set mode we use button number 1 to change the value of each digit, button number 2 to advance to the next digit, and then when we're all done it'll ask us if we want to store the changes or not. In this case we'll select no and it'll tell us cancelled and give us the option to return to normal running mode. So very briefly, that is the functionality of the new Dm2. As we've said, a lot more detail in separate videos which will cover the individual operating modes. Thank you for your interest.